Oliver had never been the kind of man to forget an anniversary. Every year, without fail, he prepared something special for Camille. Sometimes it was a quiet dinner at home, other times a weekend getaway, and once even a surprise hot air balloon ride she claimed was too much. Though she hadn't stopped smiling the entire time, but this year he decided to tone things down. Work had been stressful. Their 10-year mark felt more serious than festive, and he sensed Camille had been distant lately, so he booked a reservation at the restaurant where they had their first real date, picked up her favorite wine, and even arranged for their son, Lucas, to stay overnight at his sister's place. He told Camille he had a business meeting out of town and wouldn't be home until late the next day. He wanted it to be a surprise, but when he walked through the front door at 6:17 p.m. that evening, roses in one hand, wine in the other, the silence hit him harder than he expected. No music, no candles, no laughter, nothing. The house was dark except for a hallway lamp she always left on for ambience. The dinner table was bare. No sign of cooking. No scent of anything in the air. Her car was gone. He stood in the doorway for several minutes, unsure whether to call her or wait. Maybe she stepped out to pick something up, but the minutes turned into an hour, and the wine sat unopened on the counter, its sweat pooling on the granite. At 7:41 p.m. his phone buzzed. A message from Camille. Just a text. Working late. Don't wait up. No, happy anniversary - no apology. Not even an emoji. Oliver read it 3 times, each time feeling a colder wave settle in his chest. He walked to the kitchen table and sat down, slowly pulling the flowers from the wrapping paper and placing them one by one on the table, not knowing why. He had the restaurant reservation for 8:00. He canceled it at 9:13 p.m. He went to their bedroom. Her side of the bed was perfectly made. On his pillow, out of place, was a folded receipt from a high-end spa. Today's date, 2:15 p.m. Appointment for Camille Hartley. Full body massage, champagne package - He didn't cry. He didn't even sigh. Instead, Oliver sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wardrobe mirror. He saw himself sitting there, holding nothing, and realized in that moment that something invisible between them had already broken. And maybe, just maybe, it had broken long ago. The next morning, Oliver awoke to the sound of the garage door closing. He instinctively glanced at the clock. 7:14 a.m. Camille was just getting home. He didn't get up. He lay still, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as he listened to her move quietly around the kitchen. The clink of a mug, the whoosh of the espresso machine, the soft creak of the pantry door. All of it sounded like a carefully rehearsed dance. She didn't come into the bedroom right away. Instead, after about 10 minutes, he heard the shower running in the guest bathroom. She used to shower in their master bathroom. Until recently, that change hadn't even registered until now. By the time Oliver got out of bed and stepped into the hallway, Camille was already dressed, hair still damp, standing by the dining table with her phone in hand. She looked surprised to see him. "Hey," she said, offering a soft smile. "Didn't expect you back so early." "I wanted to surprise you," he replied calmly. "Yesterday was important." There was a flicker of guilt, or maybe discomfort, on her face. "I know, I'm sorry," she said, tucking her phone into her purse. "Work's been chaotic. I lost track of the date. Their 10th anniversary." Oliver didn't reply. He simply nodded and walked past her into the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. She lingered in the doorway for a moment, as if deciding whether to say more, then grabbed her keys and headed for the door. "I'll be late again today. There's a client pitch in the evening." "Right," he said, without turning around. When she left, the silence returned. He stood in the kitchen, coffee untouched, thoughts racing. This wasn't just stress. He could feel it. There was a gap between them now wide enough to let cold wind pass through. He picked up her coffee cup, lipstick on the rim, her favorite shade, winter blush, He remembered because he had bought it for her last Christmas. But lately, she only wore it to work. He opened the trash, and there it was, a pink pastry box with a receipt from Le Bijou Pâtisserie, a boutique dessert shop an hour away, where they used to go on weekends before life got busy. The timestamp was from yesterday afternoon. During the hours she claimed to be working, something wasn't adding up. Oliver sat at the table and opened his laptop. Not to snoop. Not yet. But to look. To start connecting dots. Camille's credit card statements were shared. They had no secrets, or so he had thought. That morning, for the first time in years, Oliver typed her name into a search engine. Nothing popped up. Nothing ever would. If something was happening, it wouldn't be obvious. Camille was too careful for that, but she'd slipped somewhere, and now he intended to find out where. Over the next few days, Oliver became a silent observer in his own home. He wasn't ready to confront Camille. Not yet, but he couldn't ignore the growing feeling in his chest. Something was off, deeply off. He began paying attention to the little things. The way her scent lingered longer in the house, like she was dousing herself in perfume before returning home instead of before leaving. The new lingerie tags he found hidden behind the laundry basket. Not in the drawer where she used to keep her delicate pieces, and the most telling detail. She had changed her phone's passcode. She never used to have one at all. On Thursday evening, while Camille was still at work, Oliver sat at his desk, staring at the family photo from their trip to Italy 5 years ago. They looked so happy, genuinely happy. He remembered taking that photo with the self-timer, her hand resting on his chest, their cheeks pressed together as if nothing in the world could come between them. Now, he didn't even recognize her smile. Later that night, when she came home, her hair was slightly tousled, her lipstick wiped off but faintly visible in the corner of her mouth. She was in an oversized coat that didn't match the shoes she wore. Her story was the same. Late client dinner ran longer than expected. Oliver nodded as she walked past him. He didn't push, didn't accuse. He just watched. The next day, while cleaning the bedroom, he found a second phone charger. One that hadn't been there before. Tucked behind the nightstand, Camille only had one phone. At least, he had thought she did. That same afternoon, he made a decision. He called Logan Mercer, a private investigator he knew from a client project years ago. They hadn't spoken in ages, but Logan picked up immediately. "Oliver Graves," Logan said with a chuckle. "Haven't heard that name in forever. What's going on?" "I need your help," Oliver said plainly. "It's personal. I need to know if my wife is cheating on me." A pause, then a sigh. "All right, I'll be discreet. Just send me her work schedule, car details, and a recent photo. I'll handle the rest." That night, Camille curled into bed beside Oliver as if nothing was wrong. Her body warm against his, her breathing soft and steady. She kissed his cheek and whispered goodnight, and he stared at the ceiling, wondering how much of what he once knew about this woman was already gone. A week passed, and the silence between Oliver and Camille grew louder. They still spoke. The usual small talk over coffee, polite nods in the hallway, the occasional "have a good day." But underneath it all, there was a strange performance going on. She acted normal, and he pretended to believe it. Logan didn't take long. On Tuesday morning, Oliver received an encrypted folder via email. He stared at the screen for several minutes before opening it, his hand trembling as he hovered over the trackpad. Part of him hoped Logan had found nothing, that it was all in his head, that the shift in Camille was just work stress or midlife discontent. But the moment the first image loaded, Oliver felt his stomach twist. There she was, Camille, his wife, sitting in a dimly lit corner booth at a bar he didn't recognize, her hand lightly resting on the wrist of a man across from her. The look on her face wasn't one of polite laughter or business formality. It was intimacy. It was affection. Her smile reached her eyes in a way he hadn't seen in years. The man was tall, probably a few years younger than her, dressed in a blazer and open-collared shirt, handsome, confident. And then came the next photo, them outside the bar, her arms around his neck, his hand firmly on her lower back, lips locked. A kiss that wasn't shy or tentative. It was practiced, repeated, familiar. Oliver slammed the laptop shut and leaned back in his chair, his chest heaving. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat there, frozen. The world felt numb, like someone had turned the volume down on life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent their entire marriage being the dependable one, the one who never strayed, the one who said no to the drinks after work, the flirty coworker, the late-night messages. And this was the thanks he got. That night, he didn't bring it up. He couldn't. Camille came home late again, humming softly as she walked into the kitchen. He watched her from the hallway. She had a spring in her step, her cheeks a little too flushed for someone who claimed to be just tired. She glanced at him and smiled. Long day? He nodded. Yeah, you? Pretty busy, she replied, popping open a bottle of wine. You want some? He shook his head. Not tonight, as she turned her back to grab a glass. He stared at her with a kind of quiet awe. How easily she lied, how effortlessly she had become a stranger in the skin of the woman he had once loved. He went to bed early that night, pretending to be asleep by the time she climbed in beside him. She kissed his shoulder, whispered, "Love you," and turned away. And in the darkness, Oliver finally let the first tear fall. Not out of heartbreak, but out of something far deeper, disbelief. Oliver knew the date was approaching, their 11th wedding anniversary. He had marked it in his mind months ago, originally planning a weekend getaway to the coast, just the two of them, something simple yet meaningful. But that was before the photos, before he knew. Now the day loomed not as a celebration, but as a deadline. Camille, however, didn't mention it, not once. It was the first time in 11 years that she hadn't brought up their anniversary weeks in advance, asking about dinner reservations, dropping hints about gifts, or giggling over past memories. This time, it was radio silence. She wasn't forgetting. She was ignoring it, avoiding it. Oliver decided to do the same, at least on the surface, but beneath, he was unraveling. That morning, he made pancakes for the kids as usual. Camille rushed down the stairs already dressed for work, her phone in hand, texting someone. Probably him, her new world. She kissed the kids on the head, barely glancing at Oliver. "You're heading out early?" he asked, voice level. "Yeah," she said, sliding her handbag over her shoulder. "Big meeting with the Vega account. Might be late. Don't wait up." She turned to leave, paused, then added, "Love you." Like a habit, Oliver didn't respond. He just smiled faintly and nodded. By evening, he had the whole house to himself. The kids were staying with his sister for the night. He had arranged that days in advance under the guise of a surprise date night. Only there would be no date, no Camille, no roses, no celebration. Instead, Oliver sat in the living room with a single glass of bourbon and the folder of photos Logan had sent. He'd printed them all, each image laid out like evidence in a trial, evidence of betrayal, of her hands, her eyes, her lips, all once his, now shared with a stranger. Around 9:45 p.m., the door opened. Camille stepped in, heels clicking against the hardwood, her perfume trailing behind her like a fog. She looked surprised to see him sitting in the dark. "Oh, I thought you'd be asleep." He didn't answer. She walked into the kitchen, dropped her purse, then glanced toward the hallway. "Where are the kids?" "With Emma," he said, voice low. There was a long pause. "Oh," she lingered, unsure what to say. But then, just like always, she chose to ignore the tension. "I'm exhausted," she said, already heading toward the stairs. "Going to shower and crash." Oliver watched her go, his jaw clenched. He waited until the water started running upstairs before he got up, walked over to her purse, and opened it inside. Her phone buzzed once. The screen lit up. A name, Julian. The message read, "You looked amazing tonight." Still thinking about that moment in the elevator, Oliver's hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles turned white. He placed it back inside, zipped the purse shut, and calmly returned to the couch. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, eyes fixed on the empty fireplace, listening to the occasional creak of the house, the soft hum of the heater, and the gentle wind tapping against the windows. But the loudest sound was the quiet confirmation that their marriage, at least the version he had once believed in, was already dead, and in its place, something colder was taking root. The next morning, Oliver went through the motions like a man underwater. His limbs felt heavy, his head clouded, but his focus was razor-sharp. He brewed coffee, made scrambled eggs, and placed Camille's usual toast with jam on the plate. Just like any other morning, she entered the kitchen, her hair damp, dressed in navy slacks and a cream blouse, smiling faintly when she saw the food. "You didn't have to do this," she said, sitting down. "I know," he replied, carefully sipping his coffee. "But I wanted to." She didn't notice anything was off, or maybe she did, but chose not to acknowledge it. That had become her pattern, ignoring things until they went away. But this wasn't going away. Not this time. When she left for work, Oliver waited exactly 5 minutes before walking upstairs to their bedroom. He opened her closet, kneeling to pull out the shoebox at the back. Inside was a small pouch with lavender-scented notes. Camille's private keepsakes. Normally, he would have never touched it, but now everything felt different. Inside, he found old letters, faded ticket stubs, and at the very bottom, a card. The envelope was embossed with a golden J. His breath caught. He opened it. "To my wildest dream. Can't wait to steal you away again soon. Miami was unforgettable. Yours, J." Attached was a photo of a hotel room key, the Fontainebleau, one of the most luxurious places in Miami. The date written on the back? Just 2 months ago. The same weekend Camille had claimed she was at a women's leadership retreat in Boston. Oliver sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the card, his chest heaving. The room suddenly felt small, suffocating. But it wasn't over. A few minutes later, he opened her laptop. One she never let him touch. It wasn't even password protected. She trusted him that much. In her email drafts was a folder labeled unsent. Inside were dozens of half-written messages to Julian, some flirtatious, others explicit, and a few that sent chills down Oliver's spine. "I don't know how much longer I can pretend he's a good man, and I feel like a monster, but when I'm with you, I feel alive. That scares me, and I love it." That was the moment Oliver broke. Not just from the betrayal, but from the realization that he had spent years giving everything. His love, his loyalty, his future. To someone who felt alive only in another man's arms. Someone who used his kindness as camouflage for her discontent. He didn't cry. Not then. The pain was too deep for that. Instead, he sat in stillness for hours, staring at the open screen, the cursor blinking at the end of her unfinished confession. And with each blink, something hardened inside him. That night, Camille returned home humming to herself. The scent of a new perfume lingered around her, floral and musky. Something he'd never smelled on her before. She kissed his cheek, asked about dinner, and complimented the folded laundry in the hallway, and he smiled. He smiled so well that she never noticed the look in his eyes had changed. Not love, not pain, not even hate, just resolve. In the days that followed, Oliver became a man of routine, calm, unassuming, meticulous. He cooked breakfast every morning, walked the dog in the evenings, and smiled through weekend brunches with Camille as if their marriage hadn't just crumbled beneath him. She didn't suspect a thing. Not because she was stupid, but because he had perfected the art of pretending. But inside, Oliver was strategizing. He started gathering records, financials, emails, phone logs. He downloaded months' worth of credit card transactions and scoured every entry for patterns. There it was. Restaurants he'd never visited, luxury boutiques he never saw her wear anything from, and 2 round-trip tickets to Miami booked under her name with 1 passenger listed only as J. Westbrook, Julian Westbrook. A name Oliver hadn't dared to say aloud yet, but one that now echoed constantly in his mind. He visited a lawyer discreetly, asking only for information, what his options were, what evidence would matter, and what might happen if he didn't act right away. The attorney was direct. Infidelity wouldn't matter much in a no-fault divorce, but custody and asset division would depend heavily on perception and proof. So Oliver decided to wait, not out of indecision, but for precision. He needed to strike when the impact would be final, complete, a clean break that left no questions and no path for Camille to twist the truth. At home, Camille seemed lighter, almost cheerful again, as if something had lifted from her shoulders. She began playing with the kids more often, smiling more, wearing that new perfume again. She even asked Oliver if he wanted to plan a getaway for their upcoming 11th anniversary. "We could use the time away," she said with a soft smile, pouring him a glass of wine one evening. "Just you and me." He took the glass, nodded, and clinked it gently against hers. "That sounds perfect," he said, steady and calm. She didn't know it yet, but that would be the last glass of wine they ever shared. That night, when she fell asleep beside him, Oliver stared at the ceiling for hours, thinking not of revenge, but of freedom, of the life he could reclaim once the storm had passed, of the version of himself he could finally become. Not the man who had been betrayed, but the man who had survived it. The anniversary weekend arrived, and Camille was radiant. She wore a pale blue sundress Oliver had always loved, her hair done softly, her perfume subtle but familiar. She hummed as she packed her overnight bag, her voice light, almost girlish. "The kids are with my sister. The cabin's all ready, just the two of us," she said, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. Oliver smiled. Slow and practiced. "Sounds amazing." They drove north, away from the city and into the woods, where the rented cabin waited like a stage set for something neither of them was prepared for. Camille chatted the whole way, about the kids, about Julian's recent promotion at her firm. She didn't even notice the flinch in Oliver's jaw when she said his name. The cabin was beautiful quiet. A stone fireplace, a king-sized bed, a deck overlooking the lake. Camille poured them wine and lit candles, playing their old playlist in the background. One she hadn't touched in years. Oliver pretended to enjoy the evening. They danced slowly for a while. She pressed her cheek against his chest and whispered, "I missed this," but he didn't answer. His hands rested gently on her back, but his heart was no longer with her. He already knew what would come next. That night, Camille fell asleep beside him in the large bed, her breathing soft and even, like nothing was wrong in the world. And Oliver got up. He stepped onto the porch, phone in hand, and sent one final email to his attorney. The subject line: "Proceed as planned." Attached were the final copies of everything he had gathered: screenshots, videos, emails, receipts. The surveillance footage from 2 weeks ago at a downtown hotel. The one where Camille and Julian walked in separately and emerged together 5 hours later, hand in hand. He stared at the lake, letting the cold air sting his skin. Then, slowly, he walked back inside and lay next to her again. She shifted in her sleep and wrapped one arm around his waist. The irony hit hard. She thought this was a new beginning. She had no idea it was already over. Camille woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of birds chirping outside. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful, like the years of emotional distance had finally melted away. She found Oliver on the deck, watching the sunrise, a mug in his hand and a blanket draped over his shoulders. He smiled at her when she appeared in the doorway, and she smiled back, her heart fluttering with something she thought they had lost. They spent the morning in quiet comfort, making breakfast together, laughing at a squirrel that tried to steal their toast. It felt almost magical, like they had stumbled back into their honeymoon phase. But under the calm, Oliver was a storm. By afternoon, they went for a walk around the lake. Camille reached for his hand, and he let her hold it. She was talking about a summer trip, about maybe taking the kids to Oregon like they'd always planned. When Oliver stopped walking, his voice was calm. "Camille," he said, "what would you do if I said I knew?" She blinked, confused. "Knew what?" "That you've been lying to me for over a year." Her hand loosened in his. Her smile faded. "I know about Julian," he continued. "I know about the hotel, the nights you said you were working late, the lingerie that wasn't for me. I know more than you think." Camille stood frozen, her mouth opened, but no words came. "You don't have to lie anymore," he added, his voice steady, terrifyingly composed. "You see, I was never the fool you thought I was. I was just waiting, letting you bury yourself." Camille's knees gave out, and she sat on a nearby bench, her face pale. "Oliver, But he didn't let her finish. "I gave you a chance," he said. "I gave you space. I hoped it was a phase, that you'd come back. But now I know exactly who you are." She began to cry, silent, shaking sobs that seemed to echo louder in the quiet forest. But Oliver didn't comfort her. He sat down beside her and watched the lake, letting her tears fall like rain he no longer felt. When they drove back that evening, the silence in the car was different. It wasn't filled with tension. It was filled with finality. He knew, she knew he knew, and nothing would ever be the same. The days following their trip passed like a dream Camille couldn't wake up from. Everything was eerily quiet. Oliver went about his days without outbursts, without accusations, without even a hint of rage. But that silence, so carefully constructed, was louder than any fight they had ever had. He wasn't ignoring her out of pettiness. He was withdrawing in preparation. Camille tried to act normal, cooking his favorite meals, tidying the house, asking about his work, his mood, anything to break through. But he gave her only polite nods, hollow smiles, and soft, measured words like thanks or sure. It was unbearable. It was as if she was speaking to a stranger who lived in her husband's skin. One night, she found him sitting at his desk long after midnight, the glow of the computer screen painting his face in cold light. He didn't look up when she entered the room. Papers were stacked beside him. Bank documents, folders labeled with her name, legal forms. "What is all this?" she asked cautiously, her voice trembling. "I'm just getting organized," he replied, his tone flat. "Preparing for what?" He finally looked at her, and the emptiness in his eyes made her stomach knot. For peace. The next day, she came home from work to find the living room stripped of all personal touches. No family photos. No framed wedding picture. No signs of the life they had built. She rushed to the bedroom. Half of the closet was empty, Oliver's clothes, his shoes, his watch box. All gone. She called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Then she found the envelope on the dining table. No name on the front, but she knew it was for her. Inside were two things: a folded sheet of paper and a tiny velvet box. The letter was typed. Not a single word handwritten. "Camille, I won't yell. I won't beg. And I won't let you manipulate me into staying in a marriage you burned to the ground. You made your choices. Now I'm making mine. You said you wanted more freedom. I'm giving you all of it. Consider this my final gift. Oliver." The box contained her wedding ring, perfectly cleaned and polished, but the stone was gone. Plucked from its setting, leaving behind a hollow frame, she sank to the floor, clutching the ring with trembling hands. As realization washed over her, Oliver wasn't going to fight. He had already won. Camille didn't sleep that night. She sat curled up on the living room couch, the empty ring in her palm like a stone pressed into her skin. Her mind raced in loops, replaying every decision, every missed warning, every moment where she could have chosen differently. But the past was sealed, and now she had to face the fallout alone. The next morning, her phone buzzed with a message from her sister. "Cam, what's going on? I just saw a post about you and Oliver. Is everything okay?" Panic flared in her chest. She opened her social media apps, and there it was. Oliver had changed his status to divorced. No words, just a black and white photo of the sky and that single update. The comments were flooding in. Camille tried to breathe, but her throat felt tight. She wasn't ready for the world to know. Not like this. She still hadn't told her parents. She hadn't told her coworkers. She hadn't told anyone, because a part of her still clung to hope. Foolish as it was, around noon, the doorbell rang. She opened it to find a courier holding a thick envelope. He handed it to her without a word and walked away. Inside were legal papers. Oliver's official divorce filing. Everything was laid out. Dates, asset lists, custody options. He had done it all while remaining stone-faced and distant. She flipped through the pages with trembling fingers until she reached the financial statements. That's when her stomach truly dropped. He hadn't just filed for divorce. He had dismantled their shared life with surgical precision. Every joint account was empty. The business investments they'd made together were now in his name. Even the car she drove was listed under his personal holdings. She rushed to her bank app. Balance: $17-23. God! She whispered, sinking to the floor, phone clutched to her chest. Oliver had been playing the long game, while she was out flirting with illusions of excitement and attention. He was documenting, preparing, dismantling. He hadn't yelled, hadn't confronted her with drama. He had simply removed her from his life with calculated grace. But what hit the hardest wasn't the money. It was the custody note. He was filing for sole custody of their son, Ethan, citing emotional instability and neglect on her part. And the evidence? Dates, photos, logs of late nights out. Notes from teachers about Ethan's recent behavioral changes. Even screenshots of messages. Ones she had long deleted. Camille gasped, her breath catching in her throat. He had seen everything all along, and he hadn't said a word. That night, Camille stood in Ethan's empty room, the bed still made, his action figures neatly lined up on the shelf. She knelt down, running her hand across the soft comforter, trying to remember the last time she truly sat here with him. Read him a story. Asked about his day, she couldn't remember. Now, she might not get the chance again. The silence Oliver once wielded like a weapon had become her prison, and she finally understood what it meant to lose everything. The courtroom was quiet as Camille took her seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the aisle, Oliver sat tall and composed, dressed in a sharp navy suit. His expression unreadable. Ethan sat between them, flanked by a court-appointed guardian. He looked smaller than she remembered, his eyes hollow in a way no child should be. Camille's heart ached, but she knew better than to cry now. The judge called the case forward, and Camille braced herself. The next hour passed in a blur of legal jargon, exhibits, testimonies, and timelines. Her lawyer tried to spin her story. Stress, loss of identity, regret. But the facts were merciless. Oliver's evidence was thorough, meticulous. His lawyer laid out a narrative that painted Camille as distant, irresponsible, and self-absorbed, a mother too busy chasing validation to see her family slipping away. Then came the surveillance footage. Photos, hotel receipts, text logs. Camille could barely breathe as the images flashed on screen. Her face, Alan's smirk. Late nights she thought no one had noticed. She turned away, unable to meet Oliver's gaze. But he didn't even look at her. His focus was only on Ethan. When the final decision was read, it came down like a gavel on her chest. Primary custody awarded to Oliver Westfield. Camille granted supervised visitation. Pending further psychological evaluation, it felt like the floor had vanished beneath her. Everything else, the financial losses, the public shame, even the divorce, none of it had hurt as deeply as this. She had lost her son. Outside the courthouse, the chill of the early spring air bit into her skin. She stood by the steps, staring blankly at the passing cars. Oliver emerged a few moments later, holding Ethan's hand. The boy glanced at her, just briefly, and then looked down again. Camille took a step forward. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking. Oliver paused, eyes still cold. "Come on, bud," he said softly to his son. "Let's go home." That word, home, hit Camille like a slap. She watched them walk away, father and son, fading into the crowd. Her world, once full of warmth, laughter, and comfort, had shriveled down to cold concrete and court orders. Weeks passed. Camille moved into a modest apartment on the edge of the city, far from the neighborhoods they once roamed as a family. She took a job cleaning offices at night, and her days were filled with therapy sessions, court-mandated parenting classes, and long, empty hours in silence. She wrote letters to Ethan, dozens of them, but never sent them. She didn't even know if she was allowed to. On a rainy Thursday evening, a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find a small envelope on the floor. No return address. Inside was a single photo. Ethan, wearing a bright green soccer jersey, smiling as he kicked a ball mid-game on the back. A short note in Oliver's handwriting. "He's doing well. Still asks about you sometimes. Thought you should see." Camille sank to the floor, clutching the photo to her chest. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a second chance. But it was something, and in that moment, she understood. Healing wouldn't come from trying to rebuild the life she lost. It would come from learning how to live with the ruins. She had destroyed something precious, but she was still alive, and sometimes survival was the only form of redemption left.